Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 14th, 2019, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And this week we have a great episode, but before we dive into it, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible each and every week. Remember, Talk Nerdyism will always be 100% free to download, and that's because of support from listeners just like you. If you go to patreon.com/talknerdy, you can learn how to pledge your support for the show and potentially hear your name right here at the top. This week, I want to thank Talk Nerdy's top supporters, Who IMIX, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Dudas Infinitas, Phil T. Bear, The Zombie Drummer, David J. E. Smith, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. Remember, you can also shop for Talk Nerdy swag at talknerdymerch.com. And one more announcement, I think I made it a couple of weeks ago, but time is starting to run out. If you are a science communicator, whether you are early in your career, whether you've been doing it for a while, or you're just interested in getting started or learning more about science communication, I highly recommend you check out SciComm Camp. I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors of the camp, along with my colleagues Jason Goldman and Sarah Curtis. This year's SciComm Camp is going to be in November in Simi Valley, which is, it's here in LA. It's about like a 30-minute drive from the city borders. It's a part of the kind of LA Metroplex area. We're going to be there from November 8th through 10th. So it's a long weekend. It's the 5th annual SciComm Camp. And we have so many great speakers. Our keynote speaker is Allie Ward. There's going to be a mentalism. Is that what you would call it? Performance by Eli Bosnick during the Science Carnival on Saturday night. We've also got Diana Cowern, Rose Eveleth, Allison Becker, Jason Schaefer, and Nadia Drake, who are either presenting workshops or working in some other capacity at SciComm Camp. It's going to be a ton of fun. And I don't know, I just really want a lot of cool people to be there. So if you're interested, go to scicommcamp.com to learn more. That's Sci as in science, SCI, comm as in communication, COMM, camp as in camping. But don't worry, they're like in hotel rooms. It's glamping. We'll put it that way. All right, guys, let's dive into this week's show. So I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Sarah E. Hill. She is a research psychologist, an author, and a speaker, and she studies health, relationships, and other forms of social behavior, and really focused in kind of an evolutionary science backing. She right now runs a lab in the Department of Psychology at TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. And she has a brand new book out. This is Your Brain on Birth Control: The Surprising Science of Women, Hormones, and the Law of Unintended Consequences. I apologize in advance for a little bit of TMI on my part during this chat, but I learned an awful lot. It's really fascinating. So guys, without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Sarah E. Hill. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to talk about your new book because this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart and my brain and my uterus and all of those things. So your book is called This is Your Brain on Birth Control: The Surprising Science of Women, Hormones, and the Law of Unintended Consequences. All of these things are very interesting to me, especially as somebody who, at the age of 30, I turned 36 in like 11 days. So at the age of 35, 36, have been on birth control nonstop since 16.
Wow.
I'm very interested to see what is happening in my body. So before we dive in, though, to the topic of the book, I want to know more about you. So you are, you have a PhD, not an MD. Are you a psychologist, or are you more of a researcher or more of a clinician?
Right. So I'm a research psychologist. My background is actually in evolutionary psychology. I got my PhD at UT Austin working with David Buss, who's like one of the big evolutionary psychologists in the world. And I study women and health and relationships. And that's sort of been the area of my research for the last, it's been almost 20 years now that I've been in the field doing this research. And so I actually came into this research topic sort of in some ways by accident, just because I wasn't, this wasn't something that I had really set out to study. Like I said, I study health and relationships and women's sexual behavior, which is tangentially related, of course, to the birth control pill and the way that it influences the brain. But it was actually a personal interest that really sort of got me going down the path of really trying to understand what it is that the pill does and like who it makes women.
Yeah. Okay. So when you say that, like your kind of your dissertation area of research, or I guess your graduate level research, and then moving into the field more as
Mm-hmm.
a researcher was kind of more health, relationships,
Uh,
women's sexual behavior. What kinds of areas have you investigated in the past?
Well, have been really interested in looking at the different types of environmental factors that influence women's sexual strategies. So for a very long time, in the relationships research, if you look at, our understanding of, mating psychology, we call it mating psychology or relationship psychology, and like sexual strategies, there's been sort of this kind of old school view that men have these different sort of variable mating strategies where they'll go after short-term relationships in these contexts and long-term in those contexts, and always just sort of assuming that females are going to be generally more or less quote unquote monogamous.
Hmm.
And a lot of this is just sort of a byproduct of the fact that it's the field of evolutionary psychology started out with, more male than female researchers. I mean, things are starting to even out now, and there's more researchers studying women and women's issues. But that's really what I was interested in, was sort of
Yeah.
moving past the sort of stereotypic view of women as being, interested primarily in long-term relationships and trying to understand what are some of the environmental factors that influence the different types of mating strategies that women have. What are some of the cues that we use when we're trying to assess desirability of partners, and really trying to understand the variability in women's mate attraction and their sort of relationship psychology and their sexual behavior. And
Fascinating.
yeah, it's like really fun stuff. Like like I have the best job. Like I don't know why everybody doesn't want to do this job because it's just so much fun to just sit and come up with an idea about something and then like get to go out and then see whether or not you're right or not. And so it's like being a scientist is like the most fun thing ever in the world. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's like so fun. And so I sort of ended up, and it actually published during all of my, sort of doing my bread and butter research on women and women's sexual psychology and how they compete for partners and so on. I'd published a couple of papers on, the way that women's changing sex hormones across the cycle influence different processes related to attracting partners and that sort of thing. And so all of this, is sort of the backdrop of like my professional sort of history, and then my personal history was, at the same time all of this is going on, that I'm doing this research and, like in the biological underpinnings of, women's, decision making and how, this biological process and that biological process influences what women, think and how they feel and how they behave. I was on the pill for more than a decade. And like a lot of women, it's like you go on the pill and you are taking it for this sort of targeted effect of, preventing you from getting pregnant. And then it also does some other really nice things for us in terms of, exactly the moment you're going to start your period and your cramps aren't as bad. And my skin looked better.
And I got a lot less sick when I was on my period.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of reductions in some of the negative period-related symptomology that women have. It's really good at managing things like endometriosis. And for women who have really severe PMS, it can really be a godsend because it sort of levels out, the hormonal shifts that tend to prompt PMS. And so it can be a real psychological benefit for women who experience that. And so it does a lot of great things. I took the pill for the reasons that most women do. And so on the one hand, I'm studying the way that hormones and other biological processes are so sort of fundamental in terms of influencing what women are, how they're experiencing the world and who they are. And on the other hand, I'm taking these birth control pills without ever thinking about the fact that they're influencing what my brain is doing. And it sort of all sort of dawned on me that my birth control pills were probably doing a lot more than just influencing the activities in my ovaries when I went off of the birth control pill. And I had this experience of sort of waking up. Like I felt like after, it was about 3 or so months after I had gone off of it. And I just sort of made note of the fact that, I've been going to the gym again and I have an interest in my appearance in a way that I haven't in a while. And I'm cooking and listening to music and doing these things that are like sort of pleasurable. Like I was doing these things that were like pleasure seeking types of behaviors. I was noticing men. I was wanting to have sex with my husband. It was like these things that I hadn't really, like they just were really muted and sort of in the background, like white noise. And all of a sudden it's like they were sort of at the fore of my brain again. And I started to wonder whether the pill might have something to do with maybe how I was feeling prior to that. And so that was sort of like one of the precipitating events that led me to this field of research. But since this is a science nerd audience, I'll tell you the other piece of it because you all might appreciate it in ways that, like, I don't know that I would like this part of the story. I don't know that I would. It can get a little tedious. But I was at a research talk at a psychology conference, and the talk that was being given was done by a dear friend of mine and a research collaborator, Dr. Bruce Ellis. And Bruce studies the effects of early life adversity on the nature of the stress response in adulthood. And I was at this talk and, it's just looking at like how childhood environments sort of fine tune or influence the development of your nervous system in ways that can sort of influence how you respond to stress when you're a grown up. And so I'm at this talk and he's going over his research results. And when he's going over the methods, he talks about how they collected data on, I forgot exactly what the sample was, but it was a very large sample of people. But then he explained that they only ended up analyzing the data in men because almost all of the women in their sample were on the birth control pill, and that women on the birth control pill don't have a cortisol response, and cortisol is a stress hormone. That women on the pill don't have a cortisol response to stressful situations. It's blunted.
What?
And yeah, well, I know exactly. No, this was
that's universal. I've read about that in papers, and papers are supposed to include women.
Right. Yeah. No. So totally. So he just like, this was like a methodological footnote, right, in this presentation. Yeah. And then he starts talking about the results, and I was like, stop, the most, the most interesting thing that you talked about was that, like, I want to know more about that. And so afterward, because he's a friend of mine, we went out and I was like, tell me about these women on the pill. He's like, yeah. So turns out that women on the birth control pill don't have a cortisol or the stress hormone response to stress. And he's like, yeah. And so we looked it up, and it turns out there's a bunch of other papers that have found this too. And so that was when I was like, wait a minute, duh, Sarah. Because, like I said, I've been studying the effects of sort of biological processes and how ubiquitous they are in shaping what we're thinking and feeling and doing. And it was then that I had the sort of epiphany moment where I sort of recognized, wait a minute, the birth control pill, it influences what our sex hormones are doing. And there are receptors for sex hormones all over the place in the body, right? There's receptors for them on our immune system cells and our, brain cells, and there's cells everywhere. And so, taking the pill is going to change what what those cells are doing. And that's going to be a really widespread effect on the body, influencing processes that have nothing to do with birth control, right? Things that are even as distal or far removed as a stress response. And so that was the sort of tipping point where I decided, let's go and do a really robust literature search, and let's dig through every single paper that's been published on the pill. And what it's doing to women's brains in particular. And so I started on this journey of printing out tons of papers, reading. We started collecting some data, our own data, looking at the birth control pill and some of the processes that we'll be talking about in our discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And it was then that I realized, like, wow, there's a lot of information out here about what the birth control pill does to women's brains and sort of how they think, feel, and experience the world. And most women don't have this information at all. Like, I really, in some ways, am one of the first people who should have known about this, given that this is my research. And I was on the pill for as long as I was. You'd think that I would have encountered some of this information at some point in my career or in my sort of personal history on the pill. And I hadn't. And so I really felt like it was the right time to start these thoughtful discussions, not as a way of like scaring women. And there's nothing, in my book that's going to like scare women away from taking the pill. I don't think. It's just going to like make us understand what the trade-offs are that we're making.
Mm-hmm.
So that way, when we are, when we're making the trade-off, to be on the pill or not on the pill, like we know what we're getting into, we know what to look for, and we can better troubleshoot the specific formulation of the pill that we're on, because there's a lot of different varieties out there and they stimulate different receptors in the brain. And so, it should allow women to be able to better troubleshoot their options. And so that is how I ended up in this area. It's really time, I think, to have these thoughtful conversations and make women aware of the research and sort of know the trade-offs that are going on in the brain with the pill.
Gosh, absolutely. And so that's what we're gonna dive into. Because like I said, I have a personal interest. I think I also do have a professional interest to some extent as well. I'm working on my PhD right now in clinical psychology. And even though I don't focus specifically on women's issues in my research, I'm interested in hospice care and death and dying psychotherapy. My, I have a social justice concentration at my university. I'm existential oriented. I'm very, very interested in like women's social justice issues. One of the things that you mentioned earlier that like rang true in my ears is you were saying, throughout your PhD process and moving forward, the field was mostly dominated by men, and that's leveling out and blah, blah, blah. But it's like, yeah, that's like the case for all of science ever.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure.
And it sucks. But the truth of the matter is, for the most part, our scientific epistemology has been informed. Like we know what we know
right
through the eyes of men.
Right. Well, we know through the eyes of men and also through the bodies of men, because,
Yes.
when we look at the research that's out there, and one of the sort of big takeaways from my book that I really want readers to spend some time, thinking about and trying to push forward and pushing for better science is that, most research and most things that we know about, especially things related to health. So anything where you're measuring biological variables, the things that we know about biological processes, a lot of them are things that we actually know about men, right? And not about women. And, and it's, which is really, means that we don't know a lot about ourselves. And it's not good. Like, I don't know if you saw that there was just a piece in the news about an HIV prevention drug. Did you see this? That is approved for males, but not females. And it's
Why?
approved for males, but because they didn't test it in females. They didn't
But
test it in
why?
enough females. Well, so science, I know. And it's, it's like science used to be overtly sexist, right? Where it was just like people didn't think that females were worthy of study and therefore we weren't included in research. And this is less the case now, especially as, you and I both noted, like there's a lot more women in science than there used to be. But what is the sort of thing that's not so great is there's sort of like two pressures that have prevented researchers from really studying women and making sure that they're studying women sort of in equal numbers to what they're studying men. And one of them is, just sort of this idea that there is, a sort of vocal contingent of individuals who do not like to acknowledge that men and women are different, right? And they try to sort of, men and women are the same and we're the same. And any sort of push, that, well, males and females are actually, kind of different from one another. And we need to treat them differently in science because we have, the way that we respond to things is in some cases, completely different. Our bodies are just not wired the same way. And they're not because of pregnancy. And pregnancy basically requires every single system in your body to have a loophole that's influenced by the sex hormones, because it has to have a lot of workarounds for growing another human being. And so our bodies and our brains, in a lot of cases, don't respond exactly the same way to, different types of medications and treatments. And so sort of not acknowledging that males and females are different is like sort of the first part of the problem. The second part of the problem, and this one's the much bigger part of the problem, and this is why we need reform in science broadly, is that, research on women and females, and I say females because this isn't an issue that's specific to human beings. This is an issue that is pervasive in animal research and even research on cells. Females are more challenging and more expensive and more time consuming to study than males. And the reason for that, of course, is our cyclically changing sex hormones. And what this means is that if researchers want to show that there's a cause and effect between two variables, so like X, causes Y, if you're going to study this in males, you can study men any day of the week and make that association. But for females, you need to keep track of cycle phase. And what that means is that you have to have, a group of females in the follicular phase of the cycle. So this is the first half of the menstrual cycle when estrogen is the dominant sex hormone. And then you need to have an equally sized sample of women in the luteal phase of the cycle when progesterone is the dominant sex hormone. And then if you really want to get sort of, careful, then you'd also want some females in the menstrual phase where sex hormones are low sort of across the board, like both of those sex hormones.
And then I assume you also have to do the additional expense of like either pregnancy testing or even just self-report, ensuring that nobody is actively pregnant. And if they are, unfortunately, usually those people get thrown out of the data pool, right? Because it's
right.
Oh, that's going to make our data all over the place. We don't want to deal with that.
Well, right, exactly. And so, so here, and trying to keep track of females. So like we recently did a study looking at the effects of the immune system on different types of decision making. Because I'm really interested in the way that immunological processes and health processes in inflammation influence what the brain is doing. And we wanted all of the women to be at the early follicular phase in the cycle just to keep track of or keep that constant. And I mean, you have to have women, instead of just like scheduling people, women have to call you when they get their period. And then you have to schedule them. You only have like 4 days, that you can actually get them in the lab. I mean, it's very, very time consuming. It's very tricky to do, and it's expensive. And the way that science works right now, I mean, you probably are well aware of this, it's incredibly competitive. You have to publish a ton of research really quickly. And a lot of the funding agencies and the journals that people are publishing in aren't requiring that researchers study the same number of males as they do females, or females as they do males. And so what researchers do in order to save time, because science is really competitive, is they will simply either not include females, right? Which is why about 90% of the animal research that's done on the mechanisms that contribute to Alzheimer's disease, which is a disease that affects considerably more women than men, has been done only on male mice. And they'll just like totally ignore it, leave the females out. And they've been able to do it. And since they're able to do it because their papers get published and their grants get funded, they do, because it allows them to be one step above their competitors in terms of being able to get access to funding and these other things that keep them, from like either losing their job or losing their funding. And so we need to really change the way that that our funding agencies work and the way that our different research journals work. And we need to we shouldn't be allowing researchers to be publishing things that don't have comparable numbers of males and females, and done in large enough sample sizes where you can actually draw conclusions about whether there are differences between males and females. And, the NIH has been moving in ways that have been promoting more research in females or in women. They haven't gone far enough. It's basically like, hey, you have to include some women in your research studies.
Yeah, that's
right?
what I was wondering. I knew that there was like a relatively recent mandate, like we need to kind of do some
Yes.
reforms here, but you're saying it's a pretty weak mandate?
It's not strong enough. I
Okay.
mean, it's like you have to include some women in your research, and in some groups, because there's sort of a lot of latitude, in terms of the individual research groups and like how they define that, right? It's very vaguely defined, including females in research. You have to have a statement in your grant proposals about how you're including women in your research. But, some groups are like, oh, okay, look, they're including some women in their research. And then other groups are that are trying to, sort of encourage more research in females. Like, well, no, this is done in a really superficial way. This isn't good enough. And so there's a lot of latitude still with the individual research groups that are making the decisions about funding, and same with the research journals. And so, we don't know a lot about what it means to be a female. And we also don't know a lot about female-related issues, including the birth control pill and what it does to the brain and what it does to every other, sort of part of our body that we're interested in part because, researchers who were studying women and women's issues weren't being incentivized, the same way that researchers have been for studying male-related issues. And
Yeah, and
yeah,
that obviously leads to a conversation about like how are people who are doing active research on, just like random things. Like I'm interested in doing this trial on this HIV prevention medication, or I'm interested in doing this trial on, a depression intervention or whatever. They need to include more women, obviously, but also we need to have a better understanding, which is what you did in this book, as to why there are differences between women and men and what those differences are.
Right. Yes. Yes. I mean, I think that there's been such a lack of education about sex and about gender and about brains, that I think that most, like, I don't know about you, but for me, I didn't know anything about my sex hormones other than that they had something to do with why I was breaking out all the time. And they had something to do with, reproduction and something about an endometrial lining that I don't remember from health class. But I had absolutely no idea the way that, for example, that my sex hormones change cyclically. I didn't know the way that that would influence what my brain was doing. I didn't understand why my brain was different than a male brain. And all of these things, like understanding ourselves and how we work is like the cornerstone of like good health and well-being. Because if we don't know any of that, like how can we take care of ourselves? How can we, sort of advocate for who we are and like things that are going to promote our health and our well-being. And so a lot of, the front end of the book is me really explaining to women, like, here's what biologically it means to be a woman and to have a female brain. And this is why your brain is different than a guy's brain. And sort of understanding like who we are and why we're that way. Because I think that like once we sort of understand that, then it gives us a better understanding of like, why do our sex hormones have such a profound role in terms of everything that the brain is doing. And even, like I said, like the immune system and the circulatory system and, almost every system in the body. Because once you realize how sort of imperative, reproduction is in terms of, the evolutionary process, and it really, it starts to make sense why sex hormones are calling the shots all over the place in the body. And then it also sort of serves as the groundstone for understanding, like, why is it that changing our sex hormones can change so many different things about women, even in areas that you would never expect. And so I think that sort of starting with these sort of basic education issues, which, we're just not taught about. Like, I didn't know about any of that stuff until I was in graduate school. I was on my way to get a PhD, and like, not everybody wants to do that.
Yeah.
It's not, as you know, it's like not, I mean, it's a hard road, but, so yeah, just like having that information, I think is so important, to women, so that way they can understand themselves and yeah, sort of push for why understanding things like our sex hormones and everything else is so important.
Yeah. And I think that also kind of like, speaking to what you just mentioned, not everybody understands like the basic mechanisms of drug action, like the way that pharmacology works, that when you take a compound, whatever it may be, whether it's orally or vaginally or however transdermally, whatever your birth control is, or a vitamin or analgesic or anything, that the reason that they exist in a commercial space, the reason you can purchase a drug and it's gone through all its testing is because it has a specific effect. Like you're looking for it to bind to a receptor somewhere in your body and then have the desired effect. But it's binding in a lot of other places too. And a lot of other things happen because of that. We just decided, and by we, I mean especially with birth control, men, because when these things first came up to the market, there were no women in any real positions of power making any of these decisions. There still are very few. That the benefits outweigh the risks. That's really what it comes down to. There's the reason that when you watch a drug and I'm saying this in an American setting, because I know I have a lot of international listeners who are like, you have drug commercials? Yes, in America we have drug commercials. And yes, I know that's
welcome to America.
Outlawed in almost every other developed nation. But yeah, it's the reason that when you watch a commercial and it's like side effects include, and there's like a laundry list of stuff, because it's binding all over your body, doing all sorts of things to you. Every drug, even relatively what we think of as risk-free drugs, are binding every cell in your body,
Yeah. I mean, it's like our body is not built by an engineer, it's like, and I think that, well, in drugs, and the way that we sort of treat drugs, right, is like we treat them like we're like, it's like putting oil in the car, right? And it's like, we know exactly where it's going to go and exactly what it's going to do. And that's just like not the way the body works, because it was not designed by an engineer. Like everything influences everything else that's out there. And it's because we were built, using reverse engineering. So it's like, we just have a lot of cobbled together solutions to things. And so everything, part of the idea of the law of unintended consequences, being in the title of my book, is just this idea that when you have an interdependent system like the body, you can't make a small change. There's just no such thing. Because as soon as you influence like something like a hormone, that like a sex hormone, I mean, forget about it. It's influencing everything. It influences, like I said, the cells of the immune system. It influences the cells of the circulatory system. It influences the cells in the stress response system, brain cells. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on. And it's like our bodies are incredibly messy. And because of that, we get these, so-called, side effects with any drug that we take, but especially one that's going to be influencing our sex hormones, because sex hormones, like I said, especially for females, given how many different workarounds pregnancy requires of every system in our body. When you do something to change the profile of sex hormones, the effects are absolutely pervasive throughout the body, including in the brain.
So this makes me wonder. I mean, and I really do, right after this question, want to dive into like, what is birth control? Yeah, exactly. What is birth control and how does the actual like downstream effect work? But before we do, and maybe this question I'm about to ask you requires that we've already done that. What is the reason? And I don't even know if you're in a position to answer this. So like, is the reason...
I don't mind speculation.
That we still to this day only have female birth control and not male birth control, because the types of side effects that men have experienced in phase 2 clinical trials that people think are like now saying, okay, that's too intense. Is it because in the 40s or whenever birth control first came out, they just didn't give a shit that women were dealing with those side effects? Like, because is it not true that our side effects are so much more severe than new trials for male side effects, yet the acceptability of those, and maybe it's just because, science is more modern now, but also because it's just never had the political will for men to be the ones who take the birth. Because it just continues to seem to me, based on what I know about, endocrinology and neuroscience, that's my, before I went into psychology, that was my background was neuroscience. It seems to me that it's easier to prevent producing sperm, or at least cut off the sperm supply, than it is to change these cyclical hormonal waves in women. Just saying.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that in part, I think that there's like, it's a complicated answer. I do think that part of the answer is exactly what you're saying. Right. And that is that, instead of targeting like, what can we do to influence, like spermatogenesis, for example, in a way that doesn't require like totally recoding a man's sex hormones. I think that people were not focused on that, and were focused more on the females, because it was guys doing the science, right? And so there's obviously,
and they were like, babies go in the lady.
Yeah.
We should make it so the lady can't have the baby, obviously.
Oh my gosh, that's the funniest thing. I'm going to laugh about that all day. That's where babies go. Yes, and I think that there is. I do think there's some of that to it, for sure. And, the ones who are doing the science, and even if they weren't, cavemen who had no overt bias against women, I think that, just like even unconsciously, just, like, all right, well, let's see what we can do for these ladies, and not, sort of targeting the men. The other piece of it, and this is sort of a little bit, this is like less political and more sort of evolutionary, I guess, is that, because women, we're the ones who have to bear the cost of an unwanted pregnancy to a much greater degree than men do. And because of that, we're willing to put up with a lot more bullshit going on in our body, and side effects, because it's so important to us. It's like when
Yeah,
you
because we
think
don't want that choice taken away.
yeah, exactly. I mean, when you think about how much the ability to regulate our fertility, like using, birth control pills, other forms of really safe and effective contraception, safe abortions, all of these things that allow women to actually, for the first time in history, to have control of their fertility. I mean, it's just like so outrageously important to us in terms of our ability to move forward economically, in order to move forward, in terms of political space. I mean, it's huge. And so women, it's like for us, we look at, mood problems or problems with our libido or problems with feeling not as vibrant or whatever, cloudy headedness. I mean, when you think about the list of complaints that women have with the pill, I mean, it really, it underscores like how important fertility regulation is to us, because we put up with all of this, and it's like, well, we'll go back to the doctor and we'll say, give me a different drug, like give me an anxiolytic, give me something to make me feel less, less anxious, because I can't go off the birth control pill.
No, like it saved my
Well,
life,
yeah,
basically.
exactly. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, it's like in a lot of ways, what we've been able to put up with is a testament to how important this issue is to women. And, and for men, it's just never going to be as important because they're not the ones who get stuck with the consequences. And so I think what, in
Yeah.
part is they're having similar side effects to what we have, but they're actually sort of shedding a light on just how unpleasant they are, because as women, we've just sort of been shouldering it because we're the ones who are stuck with the burden of pregnancy, and so we didn't really have any other choices, and so men, in some ways are saying the same things that we've been saying too. It's just that we haven't been, we've been willing to take it, whereas they're not.
And they have, I mean, options available. It's true that there's no kind of chemical on the market. There's no good chemical means of birth control for men, but they do have some options available to them that they feel or seem more extreme, I suppose. Like obviously the barrier, like condoms have always been the first line of defense. And that's something that the man, I mean, you both use, but it goes on the man. But I also have like a couple of friends who have had vasectomies at this point. I think it's just a function of how old I am now that starts to happen. But the truth is, most of my friends who have done that already have kids. And that's
Right.
why they decided to do it. So even if they're single now and it's like an added bonus, it's probably because they have the wherewithal. These are issues that they think about because they did actual family planning. They had a kid with their partner previously. They decided that that's all that they wanted in their life, and was fulfilling all that stuff. But now they want to be able to not have to worry about that. So they went
Right.
through the process of having a vasectomy, which is of course invasive, but much less invasive than any sort of like surgical intervention for a woman. I mean, it's
Well,
probably actually less invasive or equally invasive as putting in an IUD.
right. I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, I mean, it's like temporarily, yeah, having a vasectomy is like more invasive than like, for example, the birth control pill even, right? But like the pill, I mean, when you think about it, it's there's no acute thing like there is with a vasectomy, right? Where you're going and like undergoing this procedure and then, and you're actually a surgical procedure. But like with women on the pill, it's like you're basically rewriting a woman's hormonal profile for the period of time that she's on it, which is
Yeah, and that
changing
could be her
every,
whole life,
right,
like
exactly. And
me.
I mean, it's like rewriting. Yeah, exactly. It's like rewriting what all the cells in the body are doing. And, and it's just like, we need to start like sort of, taking the pill a little bit more seriously is, like again, one of these like takeaways from the book is that I think we've all gotten a little bit cavalier with it. And in some cases, I think that the benefits clearly outweigh the costs. I mean, we just sort of went over like how big of a deal the pill is for women, and it really is a big deal. And I think that when it comes to avoiding pregnancy, it's
Oh
still
gosh, I'm so sorry. Hold that thought. It's a
no, that's
delivery
so
man.
funny. I love it. Oh my God, that's so funny.
Killer, come here. It's okay. I know. It's just like an Amazon delivery. It's okay. Shh. Sorry.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. I have dogs too, and so I know how it is. It's
I
like
saw-
always at the least.
Yeah, I saw him walking up to the door too to drop the package, and I was like, "Drop the package! Don't ring the doorbell! Drop the package!" Damn it. Anyway,
Oh my God, that's so funny.
I'm so sorry. Okay,
No, that's okay. Like, I think for us saying that, we've kind of a lot of women who go on the pill, even after they, read the book and understand the different trade-offs that are being made with that. I think that a lot of women are going to walk away feeling even more confident that, yeah, the trade-offs I'm making to stay on the pill are definitely worth it. Like, I know more about myself. I understand my experiences on it, and I can better troubleshoot like what specific pill I want to be on moving forward. But the benefits of pregnancy prevention are like huge. But in some cases, it might be worth at least pausing and reconsidering depending on what the issues are that you're taking the pill for.
absolutely.
Just because, yeah. And so, so we can kind of get into what some of those things are.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. Yeah, so here's what I would like to do. So what I'm really interested in, is like maybe a general overview of kind of the endocrine pathway, sort of like what's happening in the brain and then downstream to the different kind of like organs. Just a general overview of like the hormonal pathway for especially reproductive hormones in women. And we don't have to get too technical, but just to reiterate the fact that this all starts in the brain and then, the brain talks to these other regions through the use of these like slow chemicals, hormones.
Right.
And then, some of those effects. But what I kind of want to do, and maybe this is silly and it's probably TMI for everybody listening, but if you've been with the show, you've been with me for like 6 years, so you know me pretty well by now, is I want to give you a little bit of an anecdotal kind of scaffolding. So like, let's use Cara as the template for
Love
a
it.
woman on birth control. So so a little bit of like maybe my 30-second background with my relationship with birth control is that I started taking birth control at the age of 16 before, actually maybe I was 15, before I was even sexually active, because I had very difficult periods. They were mostly painful. They weren't particularly heavy per se, but the cramping was really painful and it caused a lot of nausea. And that was a big issue for me, was the nausea that surrounded my period. So, once a month I had to miss school because I was so sick when my period, it was like the first day of my period. So that became enough that my, mom recommended that we go and we, talk to a gynecologist, blah, 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 blah. So I started with a pill. I started with like orthotricycline, like one of the first birth control pills.
Mm-hmm.
That proved to be very difficult for me because I was experiencing cyclical nausea. Every day that I would take it, like the hour after I took it, I felt brutally ill. So then they put me on a pill called called Loestrin, which is a low estrogen pill. Same issue there. Also a very strange side effect where my breasts got really tender and like full. So they felt like Charlie horses stuck to my chest. And it was incredibly painful and I couldn't handle it anymore. So stop that. And that's when at the time I was so excited because the patch had come out. And I started using the patch and used it for years, like almost 10 years. Until, of course, there were all of these like FDA warnings that women were having strokes on the patch. And so I don't even know if they ended up pulling it off the market. It might still exist on the market, but it was recommended that I stop using the patch. And now I use the NuvaRing, which is a local low hormone. I mean, compared to the pill, the hormone load is very, very low. It's more time released and it's locally worn. So you actually wear it in your vagina for 3 weeks and you take it out for 1 week. And it's like, I don't know, for any guy maybe who's listening, who's interested, or a woman who's never investigated, it's like almost like a plastic ring about this. It's a hairband. It's exactly the size of a hairband.
Yeah, exactly.
And you pinch it, you insert it, it finds its home in your vagina. You don't even feel it. It's like a very, it's invasive in the sense that it's inside of you, but it actually feels much less invasive than taking, I think, oral contraceptives for me personally. And it seems to have done the trick. Yet, here's my other like extra 10 seconds. there was a period in college where I decided that I was no longer heterosexual for like, I don't know, 6 months. And I went to my gynecologist, who was very savvy, and I was like, I don't need to take birth control. I'm only having sex with women. And she was like, you're in college and you may change your mind. But I was like, no, I'm not a trope. And so I was adamant that I wanted to stop using birth control. And so we made a plan, and I got off of the ring. And I remember calling her and saying, how long is too long for your period to last? And she was like, how long have you been bleeding? And I was like, 12 days. And she was like, you have to come in right now. You have to come in and we have to get you back on something. Like, that's too long. And so it was a real problem. Like, I don't know what would happen if I went off birth control. I don't know if I could be medically managed. And that's a real issue. My body has changed so much that I have apparently having a very long period can be very dangerous, right? Because you lose a lot of blood and tissue. So that's actually, I think, something that happens to some women. I don't know if anecdotally this is actually a rare occurrence or not, but all of these things have existed through my lifespan. I still am willing to take the risk because I am a woman in her mid-30s who has decided to not have children. I have no interest in ever having children, and the risk to me is much too high. So that's where I sit. And I've experienced a lot of those kind of classic things where like my hormones have changed so much that I don't know what the outcome is, blah, blah, blah. I also struggle with depression and have my whole life. I take antidepressants. And so who knows what the interplay is there with my hormones. I'm just fascinated to know, let's get the technical stuff.
Okay. I'm like so excited.
Let's get the technical stuff out of the way of like how it's quote unquote supposed to happen, like what you read in the biology textbook. And then we'll move into the cool stuff that you found out.
Okay. Yeah, no, I love it. So, just like to give you the way, in order to really understand how the pill works, I first just need to explain like how, things usually work in a natural cycle, and I'll keep it real short and sweet. And that is, the first day of your period is actually the first day of the menstrual cycle. So, when you have your period, you're shedding your endometrial lining, there's some bleeding that goes on. And during that time, sex hormones are very low in the body. So females have two predominant sex hormones, the sex hormone estrogen and the sex hormone progesterone. And when you are having your period, hormones are actually very low. That's when your hormones are actually at their lowest point in the cycle. And when hormones are really low, that tells your brain, a particular area in the brain called the hypothalamus, but we'll just call it the brain. That tells the brain like, oh, whoa, like, we need to do something about this. We're not pregnant. And so we need to work on getting the ovaries to produce an egg. And so they start releasing these signaling factors that go to the pituitary gland, which then sends a signal to the ovaries like, hey, get cracking on, developing an egg. And sure enough, when it's getting these stimulating hormones from the pituitary gland, that's what stimulates the egg follicles to begin, trying out producing a couple of eggs. And then whichever egg is growing the best and the strongest and it seems the healthiest, that egg will then continue to develop and the other ones will die off. And when it's developing, it releases a lot of estrogen. Right. And so estrogen builds and builds and builds and builds. And then it reaches a crescendo where it really starts to spike. And then that causes ovulation to occur. It causes a hormonal cascade that prompts ovulation. Right. And then after you ovulate, which is where you release the egg, then the structure that was actually holding the egg begins releasing the hormone progesterone. So during the second half of the cycle, after ovulation, so the first half of the cycle is what we call everything before ovulation. So this is the estrogen dominant phase of the cycle. Then the second half of the cycle is the progesterone dominant phase of the cycle. And that temporary structure is causing the release of a lot of progesterone. Some estrogens also being released. But again, like I said, progesterone is the dominant hormone. When you have that combination, that hormonal profile of high progesterone, relatively low estrogen, that actually sends a signal to the brain not to do anything, right? Because the brain is actually what causes the cascade that leads to the production of an egg, the release of an egg and ovulation. But when the brain knows, like when the brain is getting these high levels of progesterone, relatively low levels of estrogen, this tells the brain that that the body's in wait and see mode, and they're waiting to see whether or not that egg that was just released
And it
is
would only
going to
do that if
implant
it were
itself.
fertilized.
Okay, and it would only do that if it were fertilized, right?
Yeah.
But the brain doesn't know that yet, right? The brain just knows that there's something out there, and it's going to wait and see what happens next, because the hormonal profile will change in a way that's consistent with pregnancy, and that will lead to a whole different cascade. Or what will happen is progesterone and estrogen, if it does not implant, if there's not a fertilized egg, progesterone and estrogen will suddenly drop like really sharply, because the little follicle structure that's producing all that progesterone begins to shrivel up, and estrogen also plummets. And that's what causes your period to start, is this hormonal crash. Causes that's a sign that, okay, you released an egg, a week ago or whatever, week and a half ago, and didn't implant. And so now that's your brain signal to start the whole process over again. All right. And so, okay, does that make sense?
And so this is happening. Yeah, this is happening in a non-medicated.
Yes, this is like the typical. This is just a natural cycle. And so what the pill does that's so friggin' smart is it mimics the sort of second half of the cycle, right? So it's got a ratio of synthetic hormones that is sort of like progesterone dominant, right? So there's a lot of artificial progesterones, which are called progestins. So it's got a high level of progestin relative to estrogen. And so when this is released in the body, it sends a signal to the brain that the body is in wait and see mode, and that there's an egg out there somewhere, right? And that the body's just waiting to see what's going to happen next. And so that prevents the brain from releasing these precursor hormones to the pituitary gland, which stimulate the ovaries. And so, you said about your Nuva ring that it's like more localized. And my doctor told me the exact same thing, but that's impossible.
But of course, it has to reach your brain.
It has to go to the brain. I mean, that's actually where all of the action happens. And so,
it has to go back. I mean, even if the downstream effect is in the ovaries, it doesn't matter, because it's your brain telling your ovaries.
Yep, it's your brain telling your ovaries what to do. And so, and the thing about hormones, that is another thing that a lot of people don't really sort of understand, and not because they're stupid. It's just that none of us are taught in this, trained in this stuff. And that is that, hormones go everywhere. They work like a broadcast speaker system in your body. And no matter where you put them, right? If you put them in your, vagina using that, or you use the patch, no matter what part of your body you put it on, or you take a pill, they all end up everywhere, like everywhere that blood goes, because that's how they travel. They travel in the bloodstream. And so every place in your body that blood goes, which is like all the places, the sex hormones are going to get there. And so, so there's like no such thing as a targeted effect of hormones.
They're going to bind like all over the place.
All over the place. Yeah. And
so not just do they go places, but they actually fit in receptors all over the place.
Yeah. Because the body has receptors. And that's the way hormones work. It's just like, they travel like a broadcast system throughout the body. And then only the cells that have receptors for them will pick them up and read the message and then do the thing that they're supposed to do when that hormone is there. But for sex hormones, given again, like how many workarounds in the body are required of pregnancy, what you get is that, a ton, like trillions of cells in the body have receptors for sex hormones. And so when you take the pill, you're going to be influencing all of those different cells in the body. And, and sometimes it does things that are really pleasant for us, and sometimes it does things that are unpleasant, but it's definitely going to be, a lot of effects and non-targeted effects. And so, and so that's how the pill kind of does its black magic, is it prevents, your body from starting, your brain from kickstarting that hormonal cascade, so you don't release the egg, and it keeps your hormonal message that you're receiving every day constant, right? So every day is this relatively high level of these progestins relative to the estrogen, and so you had said that when you went off of the pill after you'd been on it for so long, that your body kind of like freaked out and it didn't really know what to do, and so it just started bleeding. It's called your HPG, or hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. This is that brain pituitary ovary communication system. it probably, given how long you were on it, it'll probably take a little bit of time for it to readjust itself. If you decided to go off of it, if you decided at some point that you didn't want to be on the pill anymore, just because it will have been so used to receiving that same hormonal message every day, all of your receptors for those sex hormones has been, they in part developed since you went on it. So,
Yeah, my body and brain was still developing at that point.
yeah, it was still developing. Yeah. And so the number of receptors that you have for the different types of sex hormones and everything is fine tuned to the context of the birth control pill. And what that means is not that you're screwed for life, because the thing about the body that's like really amazing is just how resilient and adaptable it is. And so if you do decide to go off it at some point, and I'm not recommending that, because like I said, if it works, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is what we say in Texas. That's what we say down here.
Yep.
But if you ever decided that you wanted to do that, it will not be the most fun time you've had in your life, but within a couple of months, your body will figure itself out. Like, the number of receptors that you have for different hormones is very much a dynamic process. And as your hormonal messages change throughout your lifetime, including things like menopause and these other things that sort of change the amount of hormone present, it also changes the number of receptors on our cells for hormones. And so, like, once your body figured that out, I think you'd be just fine. It would probably just be a little bit of a rocky road, particularly given that, you went on that so early in development, and then also have been on it for so long. But anyway, so like the sort of happy ending at that story is that no matter what you decide to do next, it'll get worked out, whether that means being on the pill or off of it.
I wonder sometimes, like, if there's, I say I wonder, I could literally just do a lit search, but if there are any sort of even just self-report studies out there that have been able to quantify, how many other women are like me in that way? How many other women have literally just been on birth control their entire lives?
It would be really fascinating. And in fact, like, I think that we need that. Well, and this is one of the things, and this is one of the sort of the things I have to keep repeating in the book is like, we need more research on this and we need more research on that and blah, 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 like saying that over and over again. But this issue in particular, it's like there is a lot of women out there. Because I was on it for more than a decade. And for a lot of women, that's just getting started. They've been on it for 20 years, 25 years. There's a lot of women who've been on it for a very long time. And it'd be really interesting to see sort of how women in your sort of camp differ from naturally cycling women, and how long, does it take to resume sort of whatever goes on next, if you decide to go off it. There's so many really interesting, research questions that would come from studying these groups of women, and they're out there. There's a lot of women, especially women in careers that require really extended educations, because it's like, what are you going to do if you're in med school or law school or getting a PhD? These things are, it's like with college and a PhD program, you're looking at 10 years. And it's like not a great time to be having children. Women do it and they're amazing. But for a lot of women, they choose not to do it because it's really, it's a challenge.
And there's a fair amount. I'd also really be interested to see if the literature has any sort of, I doubt there is any sort of kind of just pure demographic information about how many women out there like me who just don't plan to have children.
Right. Yeah.
That's just not what I want to do,
Right.
And I bet you it's a growing, percentage of, especially in developed countries, of educated women who have just decided I don't want kids. It's just not for me.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And it would be really interesting to get sort of a break, because I know that there's a growing number of women, especially in, metropolitan areas, and who have advanced degrees and that sort of thing. And it's like, they're just making a different set of trade-offs, right? Their trade-offs are sort of prioritizing career and that sort of thing. And it'd be really there's so much really interesting and also important research that needs to still be done, looking at who these women are and how are they different and how are they the same, and then are some of the ways that they differ that they don't like, are there things that we can do to try to make their options better, right? like how can we help women choose the right birth control, for example, or choose the right birth control pill, for example, because, one thing that I talk about in the book that most women's doctors do not talk to them about is that there's, a bunch of different types of pills out there, and the different pills that are out there kind of fall into these different categories. And the categories have a lot to do with the way that the hormones bind to the different receptors in the brain and other parts of the body. And, women should be sort of aware of what they're taking and then what the other options are. So that way they can best optimize their birth control strategy. Because right now it's like women are sentenced.
It's willy-nilly.
Well, I know. And it feels like women are handed down a sentence, right? Like their birth control sentence by their doctor. They're not told why they're being put on what they're being put on. They're not told what makes this different than the other options that are out there. And then what are the side effects with this particular type of progestin that I'm taking that I should be most looking out for? And then
they're afraid that even if they have certain side effects, they're like, well, I can probably just suffer through this because it's still better than the alternative, instead of having the awareness that they can literally go I don't know, man, I don't feel well on this. Is there another option available to me? And the time isn't taken to say, well, what doesn't feel well? Why doesn't that feel well? Oh, okay. It could be because you're very sensitive to X. So why don't we try this other formulation where X is not as big of a part of the, profile? And it's so funny. I literally just had this conversation last week on the show with Dr. Daniel Lieberman, but about something totally different. Our episode was all about dopamine, and we did take a while to talk a little bit about antidepressants. And I mentioned birth control as a template. I said, so many of us play musical birth control before we find the right one because we don't know what's going to work for us until we've just tried it. And I feel like it's very similar with antidepressants.
Yes, no, exactly. And here, these are both the types of medications that are going to influence, lots of different things at the same time. I mean, dopamine, holy shit, it's like that and sex hormones. Right? I mean, it's are you kidding me? They're going to influence a ton of different things at the same time. And I think that, one thing, and with antidepressants, I feel like at least because you're dealing with mental health professionals, they sort of understand and are sort of sensitive to how important it is for people to quote unquote feel like themselves, because that's part of what they're trying to do. But with the birth control pill, if you go to the doctor and say, I don't feel like myself, the conversation has all been about pulmonary embolism and stroke. And so,
right. Are you a smoker? You need to quit smoking immediately. Well, I know.
I know that. But it's the idea that you go to your doctor and say, I don't feel like myself. They're like, well, maybe we try the lower dose, whatever. And it's that's not always going to be the answer. And part of it is, I think that women haven't had their experiences sort of edified at all. What women generally talk about when it comes to the birth control pill is how it makes them feel. And a lot of times when we're talking about how we feel, we're talking about our psychology and what's going on that way. And I think that just simply understanding, here are the different domains within sort of psychological processing that we see effects potentially of the birth control pill. Keep track of these things. If things are not going the way that you want them to once you start it, this is when you talk to your doctor about trying a new formulation, and you're going to want to probably switch up, this and this. And, having that information finally, I think will hopefully allow women to be, sort of co-pilots in the development of their birth control pill strategy. Because until this point, it's we've been prisoners in some ways where we're just handed down a sentence. We don't know why we're being given it. It doesn't make us feel right. We tell it to our doctor. They don't know what to do with it because all that they've really been trained on is stroke and pulmonary embolism, maybe water retention. So giving women a language that they can use to communicate what's going on and what they think is happening, and hopefully, allowing them to work with their doctors as a partner in developing something that's going to allow them to protect themselves from pregnancy, but also to feel at home in their own bodies.
Yeah. So you mentioned before that you kind of use the phrase a lot, which we have to do in this field and many others at this point, especially most research having to do with women, more research needed. But there is some research that you were able to dig. I mean, you did a really sufficient or a really sweeping lit review for this book. And so
Yes.
maybe we can talk a little bit now that we know like kind of how your brain body works generally in terms of like maintaining a pregnancy or having a period every month, and then how birth control sort of tricks your brain. You often hear the phrase like it tricks your brain into thinking it's already pregnant so it doesn't ovulate, which I know is probably like a gross estimation of what's happening, but do you feel like that's a fair estimation of what's happening?
I would say that it tricks your body into thinking it's in the second half of your menstrual cycle.
There you go. Okay. So it doesn't actually think it's already pregnant. It's not trying to actually like protect a pregnancy. It's just saying like,
No,
we're still waiting and seeing.
it's trying. Yes, we're waiting and seeing. And that does, that does lead to sort of a cornucopia of sort of changes in psychological functioning and energy level that are consistent with what you see in pregnancy. Because during that second half of the cycle, your body, you're waiting to see if an embryo is going to implant itself. And so this is also, your body is kind of in slow down mode and like, let's eat and take naps mode.
Oh my
because
God,
it's getting
that's
ready.
all I ever want to do.
I know. That's so funny. I was just telling somebody the other day that like, all I want to do is drink wine and take naps. Like, isn't that a job? Is that a job?
It's like the best life ever.
I know. I think we should have a retreat, don't you think? A women's retreat. It'll be called the luteal phase retreat. And we'll just like, go and drink wine and take naps and it'll be amazing.
Yeah.
And someone
you
will
walk
pay
in
us.
and they just give you like a fuzzy blanket and slippers and you're like, I'm home.
I love it. It's perfect. I love it so much. Yeah. So, so there's some things about the hormonal profile that are because in pregnancy, you get a lot of progesterone really early on, in particular, also. So it's kind of the body's like sort of Earth Mother hormone, where it kind of puts you into let's just slow down a little bit in case we get a little embryo implant itself, and let's make sure we have enough energy for it, and let's eat and take naps and and that sort of thing, but not necessarily like thinking it's quote unquote pregnant. It's more trying to mimic the second half of the cycle. But again, a lot of those sort of feelings that we get during the second half of the cycle are things that are preparing your body for the possibility of pregnancy. And so I don't think it's like the most ridiculous comment that's ever been said. It's just inaccurate enough for somebody like me to come in and screw it all up. It's like when you like send an engineer to like watch a Star Wars movie and they're like, oh no, you could never fly a spaceship that close. It's like, oh God, come on.
Enjoy the movie, damn it.
Shut up and enjoy the movie. Yeah, so shut up and enjoy the cliche, Sarah, about the so I'm going to do that from now on and not ruin it for everybody else. But
No. It's good though, because I think the thing is sometimes we do have to speak in metaphor, we speak in approximations to try and at least get a general idea of what's going on. And so, okay, let's say birth control makes our bodies feel like they're stuck in the second half of our cycle.
What happens?
We know, that we're not going to get pregnant because we're not going to ever have the opportunity to get pregnant because we're not going to ovulate, right? Like that's the main thing. So there's no egg to actually fertilize, and then that non-existent fertilized egg won't be able to implant. And that's why, tell me if I'm wrong, that's why during the week that you have your period, you're actually not taking the hormones technically. You're either on like a placebo week or it's iron pills, or like with the ring or the patch, you literally just take it off or take it out and give yourself a week to have your period. And then you just start the cycle again.
Right. Yeah. And all of that is prompted by a hormonal crash, because that's like the trigger in your uterus to just like abandon ship. So when there's a hormonal crash, your uterus is like, surrender, and like drops, the endometrial lining and calls it a day. And so that's what you got there is it's this withdrawal bleed, this hormonal withdrawal bleed. And the reason that it's so good at managing, like the pill is good at managing things like endometriosis is, of course, when you're on these artificial hormones, you're not really building up much of a uterine lining at all. It's barely, there at all. And because you're not getting a lot of cell proliferation, which is something that's prompted in part by estrogen. And so it's like kind of like a pseudo period, because a period, and this is again one of those like really technical like things, but a period is technically shedding of the endometrial lining. And because pill takers don't really have much of an endometrial lining, it's really just more blood than it is anything else. And so,
that sucks.
Yeah, I know. Well, and that's why a lot of, women don't like, they don't have them, or they'll like skip that week.
They skip them.
Yeah, they skip it. And it's because there's not a lot of endometrium building up. I mean, I think it's still still smart that you go ahead and let yourself have a withdrawal bleed every couple of months, just because there are still cells going to be proliferating there. And whenever you have a cell that's growing really quickly, it can mutate pretty quickly. And so that's why another reason it's good to just like get that all shed out of there, whatever's there, every
But
once
I
in a
guess it also
while.
makes sense why when I do have my period on birth control, it's like crazy light. It's like 3 days and it's really light. And I know it's different for different women, but it's totally different than it was when it
Yeah,
was
no,
like my
it's a
natural
different ball
period.
game.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, it's a different ball game than having your endometrium build up, because that, like, when your body is getting rid of it, and that's also why it helps with cramping, is that getting rid of all of those cells that have been created to try to, incubate a embryo. It's just like, your body is like trying, like, get this out. It's like, just get it out, and it's more work, and it's uncomfortable.
for sure. Yeah. Okay. So then when it comes to the data that we have, the studies that have been done that you compiled, obviously you can't tell me everything that's in your book. And we're, starting to get to the end of the show because I've been distracting you with all my other questions. What are some of the things that we do know that birth control maybe like effects that birth control has that maybe people didn't expect or don't realize is happening in their bodies that maybe we should know about?
Right, right. So I'll leave out some of the ones that people probably have already figured out. But like, for example, I was really surprised when I learned that the pill might influence who we are attracted to and who we choose as romantic partners. Because that's like not something that you expect to have happen from your birth control pill.
Well, yeah, because so many of us are like, no, but my mind controls my brain. Like a lot of people have this like dualist mentality that like, the mind and the brain are not the same thing. And because I think it makes you feel like you've lost agency. It's a psychological thing that if you can't like that, if I take a drug and it makes me a different person, like who am I then? Like I'm not in control. And so people want to maintain a sense of control. So when you learn things like, oh, you take this drug and it changes basic preferences, it's hard for people to believe.
I know it is. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think that we are, even neuroscientists, we're all dualists, and it's accidental dualism. Like, I just don't think that, and I think that it's because the way we experience the world is so far removed from the activities of what our brain is doing that it's like hard for our brain to believe that it's, like, or it's hard for our mind to believe that that it's a product of what the brain is doing, even though that's true.
Yeah, we're intellectual monists and like emotional dualists.
Yeah, well,
for
exactly.
sure.
Yeah, it's like we know, like you and I can sit and talk about it all day long, but our mind is like, yeah, whatever, like whatever.
Yeah,
I
like,
got this.
give me the
I got
drug.
this.
I'm going to do this.
Yeah, I'm doing this. But yeah, so it can be really hard to believe that when you take something that's supposed to be, that you're taking to clear up your skin or change activities of your ovaries, that it's influencing who you're attracted to. But again, our sex hormones, they call the shots with a lot of different processes that go on in our brain. And again, it's because we've been designed by this process of evolution by selection to be, sort of do things that will help promote conception of a healthy child at times when one set of hormones is high, and for our body to do other types of things when, a different hormone is high, and so on and so forth. And so there's been research now for like, I don't know, 30 years or so showing that women in the point of their cycle when they're fertile, when pregnancy is possible, and the sex hormone estrogen is the dominant hormone, that women tend to be really kind of cued into sexiness qualities in men. So things like masculinity, like having a nice deep voice, broad shoulders, swagger, brow ridge, like a wide brow. And so estrogen seems to really sort of increase attunement to these types of cues, and also just like sort of increases the priority that women place on sexiness cues. And the reasoning behind this is that we know that testosterone is, sort of an immunosuppressive chemical. And so it's one of these things where only, men who are like healthy and have good immune systems and low mutation loads are able to produce high levels of testosterone, because for men who are immunocompromised, for example, they have lower levels of testosterone because their body can't tolerate the effects that it has. And so The idea is that during times in the cycle when conception is possible and you have this hormonal profile of estrogen dominance, that it will lead women to sort of place a high priority on these types of traits that are associated with health, so that way they can get the best genes for their offspring. Well, of course, when you have women on the birth control pill, they are never in an estrogen dominant phase of their cycle because they're on this pill that keeps them in a sort of progestin dominant hormonal profile. And so researchers are really interested in whether or not pill taking women might actually exhibit a preference and choose as partners men who have somewhat less masculine faces and are less masculine than what is preferred by women and who is chosen by women when they're naturally cycling. And there's been research now confirming this and finding that women who are on the pill do seem to be choosing less masculine partners and, and that they have a preference for less masculine male faces.
Oh, that's fascinating because it also speaks to these greater cultural shifts that we see. Not that it's, causative. There's probably just a high level of correlation across the board, like almost like a feedback effect. But I do think that we see like younger generations being more interested in androgyny, being more fluid sexually. So that probably, speaks to that as well. But the classic kind of brawny man is like sort of like your grandparents' idea of like sex appeal.
Yeah, no, that is like so fascinating because, and I talk in one of my chapters in my book, I talk about like the way that the small changes that the pill, like causes in women, how that sort of reverberates in the world, throughout the world and changes society. And I had not spoken specifically of that issue you just raised, but it's yeah, I mean, that's like perfect.
It's got to,
like,
yeah.
so
Whether it, accounts for all the variants is probably not,
but it's got to.
Absolutely.
Well, of course. Yeah, no, probably not, but I'm sure it contributes to it. And that's like so fascinating. Yeah. And so others have been really interested, and there's been a number of papers sort of showing and then not showing. And then I'm actually reviewing a paper now that's kind of looking at these issues again and like whether or not you get sort of changes in relationship and sexual satisfaction that occur when a woman chooses her partner when she's on the pill and then goes off of it. Right. Because if when you're on the pill, you prioritize one set of qualities, and research shows, for example, that pill takers tend to be more satisfied with their partner's provisioning ability. So they're like access to financial resources and their intelligence. But then, of course, the non-pill takers are sort of more satisfied with like how sexually attracted they are to their partner, how sexy they think their partner is, and all of these other things. And so researchers were kind of interested in like, well, what happens if you pick your partner on the pill and then go off of it? And what they find is, and then, like I said, I've found there's been mixed results in the literature. So this one is still there's a question mark on it. But some of the research indicates that women who go off the pill, if they chose their partner when they were on it, that they do experience changes in sexual and relationship satisfaction, and basically showing that women who are partnered with attractive men, right? So if you chose your partner when you were on the pill, and then you go off of it, and your partner, you just so happen to choose an attractive partner anyway, that you actually report more sexual satisfaction and more relationship satisfaction than you did before you went off of the pill. But for women who didn't choose an attractive partner, all of a sudden that becomes an issue. And they report lower relationship satisfaction, lower sexual satisfaction, less sexual attraction, and so on.
And so that's for women who maintain a relationship throughout these hormone changes, whereas women who are like single and have multiple partners, like the type of partner that they choose actually changes.
Yes. Yeah. And so it's totally fascinating. And so it's like one, area that is that like I could just keep hitting the hammer over and over again. We need more research on, but it's something to it's provocative, and it's something to keep in mind sort of as we're developing, as women, as we each develop our own sort of birth control pill strategy. It's just something to keep in mind, sort of moving forward into the world. Another thing that is really, really surprised me, and this sort of circles back to that original thing that research paper that got me really interested in trying to track down what all goes on in the brain when women are on the pill. And this was some of that research indicating that it changes the nature of the stress response. And again, just as a sort of recap, what I found out was that women on the pill, they don't experience a release of the stress hormone cortisol in response to stress the way that other healthy human beings do. And the reason that this particular result was so provocative to me was one, it's like stress hormones, and, it's like, it seems to make less sense in some ways than, sex hormones.
Yeah.
And the other reason it was provocative and it really struck me is because the pattern that's observed in women who are on the pill is very similar to the pattern that's observed among people who have PTSD and who've suffered from chronic trauma. And so what happens with the stress response is that, when we experience something stressful, our body within 5 minutes of that happening releases this hormone cortisol. And cortisol, of course, helps our bodies and our brains cope with stress. So it does all kinds of things like dumping sugar into the blood to allow you to run away quickly if you need to. It increases perceptual vigilance. So it makes you more likely to notice things. And it primes cells in your hippocampus, which is the part of your brain that does like learning and memory, and gets ready to sort of file things from short-term memory into long-term memory. So basically, when you're stressed out, you remember stuff, right? And you remember it so that way later on, if you encounter similar things, you know what to do and how to handle it. Well, so that's what court does. It's great. It's an amazing thing. But the body does not like a prolonged cortisol response. And the reason it doesn't like it is because it totally wreaks havoc on every system from the top to the bottom. And this is because the way that cortisol fuels the stress response, like the coping mechanism, is by directing energy away from everything it normally does for regular bodily maintenance. And it takes those resources and dumps them into managing the stressor. And so what this means is that your body isn't able to do its normal cell repair thing. It's not able to manage the immune response. It's not able to do anything that it normally does when cortisol is present. And this is actually, and Robert Sapolsky, who I listened to your interview with him, and I loved it because I love him too.
He's the best.
And I loved, he is the best. And like why zebras don't get ulcers was like so good. And he talks about it there, where he talks about like, with Pacific salmon, the reason their bodies fall apart after they swim upstream is because of cortisol. And it's because they have this extreme cortisol response, and it literally makes their bodies fall apart. And if you block their adrenal glands, which is where cortisol is released, they don't fall apart at all. Like the thing that's making them fall apart is cort. And that's why your body like does not allow it to go on for too long. And so for this reason, when you're dealing with folks who have trauma or like PTSD, people who've experienced chronic stress, their stress response system, because it's chronically activating cortisol, is, rather than making the person sort of, follow the fate of the Pacific salmon and just have their whole body fall apart, it'll just shut itself down. Like the stress response will just like say, oh, all right, enough. You're not doing that anymore. And it stops. And so I was really curious, like why are pill-taking women, because when you look at all of the research, and I'm not going to bore everybody with the details of it, but when you look at each one of the steps that takes part in what's known as the HPA axis, which is the body's stress axis, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, each one of the steps in that chain is being shut down. And this is the type of thing that you generally only see when the body is like, we aren't doing this anymore. And so, this suggests that there's something that's going on with the pill that's causing it to go into stress overdrive. And in one recent study, some researchers really looked at this systematically and looked at several markers of chronic exposure to stress within the HPA axis, or within this, axis that causes the release of cortisol. And what they found was that pill-taking women exhibited all of the biological markers that they measured that are consistent with a chronic stress response in the body, including having a shrunken hippocampus. And your hippocampus, of course, is responsible for learning and memory. And having, a shrunken hippocampus is like what we see in the case of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And so it's like something that is, important for us to note. Again, I don't want anybody to be alarmed by anything because we don't yet know enough to be alarmed about things. And I think most of us who've been on the pill for a long time can tell you that we are still
Totally.
able
Yeah.
to think and remember, just, exactly. And so, we don't know what we'd look like if we were the control
And they're
group, but we're doing all
slow
right. So it's
changes,
okay.
right? So we may not be noticing
But
them. Yeah.
yes, exactly. Yeah, well, exactly. And they might not be, and it's like all that we know is what it looks like. We don't yet know what it does. And so, but all of this suggests that there's something going on with the pill that is stimulating cortisol receptors to the point that the body thinks that it's in a full scale stress, shutdown. And currently we don't yet know like what it is that is causing these effects, but we do know that it does look like there are some downstream consequences that have been captured by the research. Like in terms of, for example, one of the things that cortisol does is it sort of flags emotionally valenced information as being important and allows it to like migrate into our long-term memory. And there's been some research indicating that, because pill-taking women have this blunted cortisol response in response to actual stressors, because the stress system seems to be shutting itself down, that pill takers do have impaired memory for emotionally valenced events. They don't tend to flag those things as important, and they don't get filed into long-term memory to the same degree that they do in women who are experiencing the cortisol response. And there's also, research linking pill usage to problems with emotional and mood regulation that also might be influenced by what goes on with the HPA axis. And so at this point, there's more future questions than there are answers. But it's, again, a lot of this information is for women to sort of make note of. And if they're on the pill, or they're considering going on the pill, it's just making note of how they're doing in each one of these domains. And then if they feel good about what's happening, great. And if they feel bad about it, not to just say, all right, well, forget about the pill, but rather talk to their doctor about trying a different version. Because, we are not at a place in the research yet where we can make really clean predictions about which individual woman is going to respond what way to which pill. And so a lot of it is just sort of troubleshooting, and each one of us is going to be our own biggest ally in terms of, creating individualized medicine for ourselves. And a lot of that's going to require just sort of keeping track of how you're doing, and making sure that you're feeling good more days than you're feeling bad. And that if you're not, having more conversations with your doctor about ways that you can feel more at home in your body.
Well, I'm happy that I can blame my hormones and my birth control for the reason that I never remember important dates, or like what I was wearing, or like what he said, or
Oh, I love it. I love it. I love it. It's perfect. It's perfect.
I'm not the
Yeah.
one
So on the
ever,
new,
in a relationship.
on the new,
Yeah, who does that?
on the relation, like on the birth control pill package, to say may explicate you from forgetting your partner's birthday.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, amazing.
It's like perfect. I'll be like, I'll take it for that and the clear skin.
Yes,
Thank
and the
you.
clear skin. Thank you so much. Oh, and less pain, less pain.
Yes, yeah.
Sarah,
Yes,
oh my gosh,
exactly.
there's so much more we could talk about, but I've already kept you for like almost an hour and a half. It's horrible. This is so much fun. Before He's so much fun. Before we call it quits and say goodbye, I would love though to close out the episode by asking you the same thing that I ask all of my guests at the very end of the show, which is about your kind of setting your sights on the future and some of your thoughts about kind of where things are and where things are going in the world. So if you're ready for these big picture questions, I'm gonna hurl them at you now.
All right, let's go for it.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so the first one is, when you think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you right now, I'd love to know, number one, what is the thing that worries you the most, keeps you up the most at night, that you're like legitimately concerned about, maybe even cynical about. And on the flip side of that, what are you genuinely excited, optimistic, and looking forward to?
Yeah, so like we'll start with the bad things, and yeah, the thing that really worries me, and I have kids, and so of course I think about this a lot, is just the growing trend of perceived social isolation and the growing suicide risk in our young kids. And I think, the world is changing in a way, and this is, probably I'm going to write a book on this. It's like about the mismatch between sort of the environments that our brains and our health are optimized for, and
Like
the
being
environment that we
outdoors.
currently live in. It
Yeah.
used to be that when we would do things that were pleasurable, like when we were chasing pleasure, we were also getting meaning. So like the desire, like being with around other people and seeing what they were up to is pleasurable, and we get meaning from that because we're building these really positive relationships. Or we used to get pleasure from eating sweet and fatty foods, and we were also getting nutrient dense safe foods, because historically that was meant that we were eating non-poisonous things and not that we were eating ice cream sundaes. And we used to, like, males, for example, like if they were like experiencing sexual arousal to a female, it usually meant that they were about to engage in, an act that was a two-person exchange, um, that like promoted bonding and togetherness and these other things. And it's like our world now, it's like we've sort of, because pleasure has been commodified in almost every domain out there. Like we do all of these things and our brain thinks that we're doing something meaningful, but we're not. And instead, we're doing these things to seek pleasure and we're not getting the meaning in response. And because of that, I think a lot of us end up feeling sort of empty and we don't know how to fix it. And I think that is sort of, with all of the internet and social media and everything else, that it leads us to feel socially isolated and alone. And I think that this is part of the reason that we're experiencing the rise in people who are on antidepressants and anxiolytics, and also seeing more people taking their own lives. And so I really worry about that. And like, how do we help empower people to like feel better, and how do we change society to feel better and promote well-being, and sort of not see the need for well-being as a character flaw, which is how it's treated. It's like we treat happiness and all of this as like a character flaw, like the need for that, because we're treated like robots. And that's the thing I worry about the most, I think.
And what are you like actually excited about? Like in a kind of not in a meaningful way, in an actually authentic way.
Yeah, as opposed to this like complete inauthentic bullshit I've been spewing at you for the last hour
No,
and a half. No, I'm
no,
just teasing.
as opposed to what I think most people are like, the children are our future, or they, and it is true to some extent, but like I do think that it's common for us to be like, oh, I mean, the
No, we have like I'm really excited about, yeah, and this won't be the we are let's all sing Kumbaya. I'm really excited about singing Kumbaya around the campfire with my fellow man and woman. No, I mean something that I am really excited about is like I feel like science is at a really cool place where we're actually starting to reward people from thinking outside the box a little bit. And I think that that's the reason that we're getting things like using our immune system to fight cancer, and, these sort of like kind of outside, like, let's use what our body is optimized for. Again, it's all evolutionary sort of grounded stuff, right? Like, let's use, like, our body has all of this wisdom in it. Like, let's use some of that wisdom to like cure itself. And I'm really excited to see the way that we're going to be going. As I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, like I'm really interested in health and ways that we can promote health and promote mental health too. And I'm really excited with the newest, sort of batch of researchers that are coming out here with some really sexy new ideas that really sort of tie in our body's wisdom in terms of like, treating itself, and like how we can use that information instead of treating the body like a machine, but understanding like that we have all these like processes that have been working for millions of years, and how can we harness the body's own wisdom to cure itself. That type of research, I think, is going to be like the next breakthrough in medicine, and I'm really excited to see where it all goes, and watch as we sort of ease suffering and make people's lives better that way.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I agreed, fully agreed with that. Um, Gosh, Sarah, this has been a fascinating chat. I feel like I could talk to you for hours.
I know. I think that we should just like have a 1-woman show or 2-woman show.
Yes.
Go on tour.
I think that you need to write that next book so that I can have you back on the show to talk about that, even though we could just talk about birth control for like
exactly.
a million more days.
Yeah, exactly.
This has been fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And before you go, can you let everybody know, like, are you active on social? How can they kind of follow your work and follow your interest areas?
Yes. Yeah. So we'll just start with my book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, The Surprising Science of Women, Hormones, and the Law of Unintended Consequences is available now on Amazon. So I encourage everyone to read that. It's fascinating for men and women. In fact, some of the men who've been reading it have been the ones who are like the most sort of surprised and excited. So it's a good book for men and women. I have a website, and that's www.sarah with an H, so sarahehill.com. And I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and my handle on all of those platforms is Sarah, again with an H, Sarah E. Hill, PhD.
Very nice. Well, Sarah E. Hill, PhD, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I had so much fun.
Me too. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.